The current globalization debate, where we could argue against the free market because sin is always present there and economics would just necessarily need, would need the government or political rules, international rules, which take care of the sin, which obviously is present there.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking also about this, and particularly because we are no longer in the way in which we understood the role of international legislation and also international politics. It's hardly the case that the problem of the economy in general is being addressed, and particularly in the places where people are most destituted. The old concept of the economy, as it was in the Middle Ages, in a strange way starts to regain an importance. People that are quite deprived of the means of survival, for them the question of reproduction is as important as the question of production, right? Pension plans for many people are to have more children, right? This is part of the question of reproduction itself. And so we need to understand that even when we get, for example, the whole debate about in the Episcopal Church regarding the bishop's criticism from Africa of homosexuality, can only be read not as some relics of an old pietism, as much as it is a reflection of an environment in which life is so much at stake, that the question of reproduction and sexuality is so much united with the question of production also.
Would any of the rest of you like to raise questions for each other or to make comments on the themes?
Sure, I'll ask one question, Christiane. We started our conversation a little bit over lunch, so just to bring you up to speed. One of the interesting questions I've noted throughout the weekend is the distinctions, recurring distinctions, inner, outer, spiritual, temporal, and so forth, and trying to think through, in terms of Luther's two reigns or the two kingdoms doctrine. So how do we determine which reign is which? And I think that's one of the interesting questions that we need to think through a little bit about, sort of locating them. It's one thing to have a structure, but then how do we sort of make sense of that, and how applicable does that work for us today?
During lunch, I was suggesting the following distinction, to say the spiritual kingdom has to do with God's relation to us through Christ, and the worldly realm has to do with God's relation to us in every other regard. And this of course does not mean that we can now make a list and here it is and here it is not, but it is, I would say, the spiritual realm is not the church. The church is also, in its visible sense, is also something worldly where God relates to us.
Just to use as an example, you mentioned Luther's support for the early support for the peasants, right? If I remember correctly, when he received a copy of the 12 demands, or what they were called, from the peasants, right? And with the exception of one, they are all very earthly demands, like the death tax, hunting in the forest, and so on. And although you are right, Luther had this, but he makes an interesting remark, and I wonder how you are going to react to that. He says, but this question that you are raising on your demands are issues that should be addressed to lawyers, right? And so he's making a distinction, so he's trying to avoid the theological claim on the earthly questions as such.
But I think that would this not fit to what I tried to explain, saying, well, those questions belong to the worldly realm, and they belong to natural law and reason, and here we have to argue, and the lawyers, they know something about that. And he says explicitly, I don't know anything about that, I'm a theologian, which I would question if we just, as theologians, would reduce ourselves only to those mere spiritual questions. But he would never say the final judgment should be to the lawyers.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that raises kind of an interesting question in terms of the common reception of the two reigns is the church is sort of the spiritual realm. But I mean, you've done well to remind us that the church also is a player in the temporal realm. And it has a voice, right? So I think at one level you could sort of accuse Luther of copying out. Everybody has something to say to to issues of justice. It's not just given to the lawyers to speak to justice.
Yeah, by the example, I think Luther falls into that separation that you are trying to avoid as well, isn't it so?
When he says he himself has not to say anything
Yeah,
about
he's
that.
not going to say anything about that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think one could argue he's not only a theologian, he's also
Yeah, exactly.
he's also part of the society, and he's also, or maybe this is a bad distinction because of course theologians are too, but he's not only addressing spiritual questions, his duty is also, as you said, to address political questions, but maybe in a different regard and with different arguments.
I think the one thing that makes people nervous about the church speaking in the public square is the imagination that in some fashion the church, when it speaks in the public square, brings with some sort of a spiritual aura that precludes the possibility that it can be critiqued in turn. And I think, when I say the church has a voice in the public, it has to say something. As we enter into the public as citizens with a vocation to say something, we also open ourselves to hearing back. It goes, if there's a conversation, it has to be both ways. So.
And this is why I actually like Luther's distinction of the two realms for political discussions very much, because it says if you enter the public realm as a church, you should argue. You should not just say this is what God wants.
Yeah,
you should try to really you have to use reason here,
Right.
and it's not enough to say this is what God commands.
Are there any further questions among you for you? Okay, then let's open the floor to broader discussion. Yes, here and then in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Bishop Munibunan from Jerusalem. I would like to ask, some questions, two questions, in fact. It's noisy. The first question is, I'm really happy that Vitor spoke about that the majority of Lutheranism now is in the south and no more in the north. But you see, at the same time, when we are speaking on global Luther, also the majority of Lutheranism at the moment are living in a non-Christian societies. And this is the reason that Martin Luther lived in a so-called Christian society when he spoke on two kingdoms and what is the role of the church. Now, being, Luther scholar or yourselves, I would like to ask, what would Luther advise us in the South? How political should we go? To be like Pannenberg or to be like Romero and Boff with a fire for the liberation theology in politics? That is really one of the questions that is always raised in the South, in the Southern Lutheranism. The second question, if the peasants were living under political oppression or under occupation, what would Luther advise them, the global Luther, and what kind of tradition? Should they follow a violent resistance? Should they follow what Bonhoeffer said, a little violence to end the bigger violence? Should they follow pacifism or nonviolence? What is your advice?
Simple questions. Difficult questions. Very difficult questions. Maybe I begin with the violence question, because I know something about Bonhoeffer, so I'm it's easier for me to react to that one. I think it's impossible to answer this question from a general perspective and say, well, in any case, use violence, or in any case, don't do that. Bonhoeffer was very aware that when he himself decided to participate in the plot against Hitler, that he is at this time violating God's law. So it's not just, okay, in this situation we can do this, here it's a good deed. No, it's a bad deed, and it's just, as you said, it's the less evil thing to do in this situation. And I think he would, or I think in such a situation it's important to really have a look at, in our state, in our political cause, with our specific ruler, what is the chance, and how can we achieve better, and how worse is the situation in which we are. So I find it difficult to say, well, in every country there, just do it like that. And I would say there are situations where violence might be the only means. And interestingly, Luther himself was, in regard to the question of is resistance allowed or not, there were some situations where he said, well, here we have to do it because it's getting so extreme that we we are allowed to do this. And the first question was the question of should we use liberation theology to help us here. I would say yes in that regard, that I think the true aspect about liberation theology is that it says, because we are free in Christ, we have the right to fight for our freedom, or to engage in the fight for our freedom and to draw those political consequences. From my perspective, it would always be important to not mix it up in that sense that you say only those who fight with us are Christians. There might be those situations, I try to say, these situations of the status confessionis where we really have to come to that point. But I would, from my perspective, I would say if we always have this, only those who fight with us are Christians, I would be very afraid that Christianity is reduced to a mere social program.
Other responses to that question in particular?
If I may, just a brief comment, just a correction. The Lutherans are not yet the majority in the South, but I said that probably in a decade one can suppose that that's going to happen. But your other comment is very much interesting. It's very much linked with that, because I think even more important than having a majority of Lutherans in the Southern Hemisphere is the fact for the way in which that's going to influence the agenda of Lutheranism and of Lutheran studies, and I insist on that also of Lutheran studies, is the fact that the questions being posed are questions that have not been posed before, because the dominant, the hegemonic theology that's done and Lutheran research that is done from perspective with the agendas of people in societies in which the majority are already Christians. And so there are major majorities or major minorities in the South in which not only they are becoming the greatest number of Lutherans, but they are living in the neighborhood of people of other faith, and in the many of the cases, or even the majority of the cases, they are minority communities inserted in other. I did not mention the sect, and I thought about that because this is so important today, because it's going to be addressed later today, and also because I did not address the question of the church. But in Luther's understanding, at least as far as the orders, these orders are concerned that I was discussing, the question of the interfaith relationship or interreligious relationship is a question that really belongs to the ecclesia, right? To that one that is created for Abraham and all his descendants in the day of Shabbat. That's Catholicism, that's universalism, right? Everyone has been addressed and is being addressed by God. The response that we give, that's another story.
Thank you. A hand in the back row, then there are two in the center.
This is addressed to all three of you, since all three of you, in one way or another, touched on some of the ambivalent aspects of the two kingdoms doctrine. And I'd like to take that same inquiry to think about justification itself, the Lutheran doctrine of justification. And going back to the urban legends that we spoke of on Thursday, I was in a seminar recently in which the leader mentioned the opinion, I believe, of Emmanuel Levinas, that had the German consciousness not existentially appropriated the notion of forgiveness of sins, including forgiveness for even the most heinous deeds, then the Third Reich, the atrocities of the Third Reich, could not have happened, that the Lutheran notion of justification in that sense was a kind of precondition for those horrors. And what was interesting to me was that many of the members of the seminar just nodded. That was a truism to them. And so from that incident, that has led me to think as to whether there are attendant ambiguities that are always implied in Lutheran understandings of forgiveness of sin and justification as it moves into a global context. And if those ambiguities are always there, how might we navigate them? And I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
To give an initial stab, I think the truism to some degree is undone by the fact that the confessing church didn't abandon the theme of justification. The Barmen Declaration doesn't undo it. There's a clear sense that the kind of crimes that are committed, and it wasn't just in Nazi Germany, but beyond, that's evil at a different level. And I think my concern would be that kind of a truism would reflect that in somehow we've mastered evil. We're able to articulate where it comes from, the whence of evil. And in my estimation, that evil. Once you think you know and can articulate exactly where evil comes from, you've lost sight of the horror of it, I think. But, that would be a starting point, maybe.
I've never read any statement of publications during the Third Reich where somebody says, well, we have justification, so why do we worry about the Jews? Or why, no, I should say more precisely, why do we worry about the bad things we do? That's not the argument. So then that would be the point to say, well, we are justified and we could just move on doing bad things. I've never read something like that. I think the problem, exactly the two kingdoms doctrine, this was exactly the problem in the Third Reich, and not only in terms of Eigengesetzlichkeit, even more in terms of mixing up the two kingdoms. So if you go through publications of the German Christians during those times, you will very often find the notion that in the orders of nature we find God's will, and in the Führer we find God's will, and stuff like that. So it's more not carefully distinguishing between those realities and saying what happens here historically. And these might even be notions that we find in Luther's writings saying here are things which happen in history which we can identify with God's doing, which is more problematic in this time. So there are two problematic lines in the Third Reich. One is Christians saying Eigengesetzlichkeit, we don't interfere in any way, they just should do their thing. And the other thing is Christians supporting it because they say what is going on here in the Third Reich is just God is acting here. Finally, we see races, this is what God does, and so on. So this is the second problematic thing, but I've never read this, we're justified to just move on with our sins.
Okay. Yes.
I wanted to come back first to your question, Bishop Yunan. I'm sure you will tell us later on in this day your advice to your question. But because I'm working with Lutheran World Federation, I want to give a bit of my opinion to your questions, what Luther would advise for the churches in the South. And I would relate it then to a question to you, Vitor. I think Luther would give the advice to the churches in the South, depending from the situation they're really in, that they should do everything to contribute for developing a strong law, which is structured by human rights. And also do everything to develop independent and strong institutions of law, which means independent courts. I think that's the main thing which would be on the political sphere. Churches, if they be in a strong minority or in not that strong minority, could do in their countries. And this is not an easy thing for the churches, in my opinion, because quite often they are not convinced that human rights are a good thing, because you have certain implications for their own structure. And quite often I think it's a problem, for example, with subversive paternalism in Lutheran churches, or kinds of favoritism, which you have also in churches, not only in the societies the churches are in, but also in the church itself. So in my observation, it's causing problems for the internal structure of churches, how they relate themselves to the area of law itself. I'm very interested how this discussion will go on in those countries. Now come back to my question I have to you, Vitor. I actually liked your whole the conception you proposed to us, and I'm not really sure if I understood you right, because I wonder that you put forward such a liberal theory. You told us the role of the state is to secure the not alienated economical activities of individuals who are in that sphere of economy or should be self-responsible for their activities and securing their goods and the needs and so on and so on. This is a very liberal conception, and I could not really see what role the church, or is there a role of the church inside that conception? If not, then actually it comes quite close to what Christiane put forward, which was actually would be a position where in the maximum the church has the role of reminding the state what the task of the state is, to secure this kind of free enterprise economical activities of individuals, but nothing more. Or do you imagine more to that? Probably I misunderstood you. This is my question.
I don't know why you call this liberal. At least in my understanding of what liberalism means, or the liberal tradition that comes from Locke onwards in the British context. That's the way in which I interpret the liberal tradition. That is not a function of the state of politics. Is not a positive way of enforcing the way in which production is going to be protected, but exactly to stay away from intervening in the means of production itself. So if that is liberalism, that's not what I'm talking about. If that is the liberalism, I'm talking about being about positive rights, the rights for sustenance and for production and reproduction, as I said. So it's not the negative concept of rights; it's the positive concept of rights that I'm defending.
Okay. Professor Tietz? Oh, I'm sorry. The next speaker. Okay.
Is this on? Okay. I also had a follow-up to Bishop Yunan's question, but focusing on the specific situation in which Luther found himself. And I'm wondering if there might have been political or strategic possibilities or options open to him that he did not follow for one reason or another. Might he, for example, have made a more effective case to the princes that they should respond to the legitimate demands of the peasants, appealing to their consciences, if not to their self-interest? So that might have been one, if he had engaged himself more directly in the situation that was coming about partly as an outcome of his own proclamation of Christian freedom and priesthood of all believers and so on, sort of opening up a situation that was opening up in response to his own theology? Or might he have taken a more effective role in relation to the peasants, perhaps counteracting the influence of Münzer and saying to the peasants, in effect, it's not in your self-interest to engage in violent revolt. You can't win that struggle. There are other means by which you might accomplish, in a limited way perhaps, some of your objectives, say strategies of nonviolence, something like that. So just sort of thinking about other courses that Luther might have taken under the real circumstances in which he found himself. Or is this simply idle speculation, and do we have to conclude that this is one of these tragic consequences of the historical process in which one event leads to another and sort of spins out of control?
If I understood the historical development correctly, the first text he published actually really tries to do this. So he says to the princes, negotiate and sit together and try to find justice here and listen to the peasants' claims. But then it was already very late, and the next paper comes out where he had experienced the revolt, and this is for him now it's almost as everything is too late, and the world is collapsing, and there's chaos in front of the door, or already coming into the room, if you will. So I would say if you might have been more involved in developments here, we would maybe find admonitions admonitions in regard to the princes, which are more like in the paper we discussed, the text of his, which we discussed yesterday, saying you have responsibilities here and you should care for those things, you as noblemen, more carefully. But then everything exploded and there was no time, and he just needed to say, well, stop this to the princes. Yeah. But interestingly, if you read those texts, he nevertheless says, do not just kill them. It's not just kill as many as possible or something like that. He still has this, there are some who were just overwhelmed by the movement, they are not part of it, or some people who confess and they are sad that they did it, so he still tries to find some moderate response to the situation. So it's a mixture of this rush or harsh language and the very unfriendly rhetoric, and then there are still some elements in it which try to find a way in between, even in the later publications. And even, maybe if I may add this, I think even in the third text, it's that he still says to the princes, it's your fault that it came so far. So it's not just the peasants, it's the prince's fault, and not only that rebellion, it's the fault because you didn't, he doesn't say, it's your fault that you did not kill them earlier, it's your fault that they revolt because they are really living in a very bad situation. And I very much appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah, I think Luther has very interesting insights, betrays them, enforces them here and there. And I think we saw that case here. But in other places, we can find a lot of examples in which he goes publicly into some issues. For example, I think there is no harsher text of Luther on this social question like the 1540 admonition to the pastors to preach against usury, which is interestingly a text that's not translated into English as far as I know. It's a long text, is a very complicated but harsh commentary on the financial system of his day. Is the harshest that I think I have seen of Luther, and which is very has been very influential throughout history. Marx quotes that text in Capital 1 in the third volume of Capital, and that's where he says that Luther is the first German political economist. Yeah.
Professor Dieter.
I have a question to Professor Westhelle and to Professor Jorgensen. My question to you, Vitor, is when we look at Luther's distinction on the politia and in the oikos. This is the Aristotelian world, but this world ended about 1800. And the world after that is totally different, and I think it cannot be described with Aristotelian means. So from that time on, Aristotle was studied with the consciousness of a historical distance. And what does this hermeneutically mean? I think one of the reasons that we do not deal so much with Luther's political theory is that we simply take seriously that we live in a different world. This is not Luther's mistake, but I think there are very clear limits of what we can gain from Luther. So this would be my question to you and to Professor Jorgensen. When I was once looking for the phrase common priesthood of all believers, allgemeines Priestertum aller Gläubigen in Luther, you make the interesting observation that this doesn't appear in Luther. There is no, this phrase doesn't exist in Luther's works. And of course, he says that by baptism all Christians are priests, but I think this should warn us a little bit. And Timothy Wenger wrote an article called The Myth of the Common Priesthood, making the argument that what we normally understand with common priesthood is more a pietistic invention than a Lutheran idea. And I have two specific questions. How would you explain that Luther can say that by baptism we are priests, and one task of a priest is to preach, to tell human beings about God? But how does this happen without mentioning the external means of the divine communication? Luther had a catechism in order to educate people. But for me, the astonishing thing is that never, when we talk about the common priesthood, we mention that the priests have to be educated in order to be priests. And my concern is that a certain understanding of the common priesthood is simply spiritualistic, that we expect that simply by being baptized, people are equipped to be priests. And our present reality shows that this is a very unrealistic assumption. And
when they were baptized in the Red Sea, then only 3 months later, Moses declared them a holy nation, after which they received the 10 Commandments, which is education.
Okay, my second question is, you mentioned the parish, the congregation as the Vox Christi. Again, the question is, it's the whole church in which people are baptized. And how do you think that the relation of a specific congregation to the whole church is? Normally, the response is, well, there's a spiritual relation, but is this really acceptable according to Lutheran standards? Because as far as I understand Luther, everything what is spiritual has also an external means. But you didn't mention this external means, and I think here we should talk about the ministry and in this whole question. And again, my concern isn't this concept of focusing on the congregation as you did a spiritualistic one.
Sure. Well, thanks for your questions. They're helpful. Yeah, regarding the priesthood of all believers, the first comment, one of my colleagues says, in his estimation, most Lutherans receive the priesthood of all believers, that idea via Spener, and it's kind of misconstrued. And I think you simply think you're right. Luther, of course, sort of the famous quotation about, should a group of Christians find themselves in a desert, how can ministry proceed? Well, they'll choose one among them, ordain that person, and that person will provide ministry. So it's certainly, Luther does not understand the priesthood of all believers to mean that anybody and everybody can and should baptize, preach, and celebrate communion. I mean, the desert scenario clearly has an ordination scripted into it. In my longer section on the order of ministry, which I skipped for points of time. That I think I spelled out a little bit more clearly. Regarding the parish, well, the parish, in fact, I'll have to double check my text, but I don't use the language of parish very often. And in fact, the point I try to make is that the concretization of the communion of saints takes place in the event of baptism, proclamation, and Eucharist. That the Eucharist, this preaching of the word and the reception of baptism is the means by which the Spirit makes real the body of Christ. So I think my paper, well, I'll thank you for your criticism, but I'll look at it more carefully. But the centerpiece is the Eucharistic, baptismal, and charismatic theology. It's in the word and sacrament that the event of word and sacrament that the congregation of the faith is concretized. Not parish language is actually not that important to me. I mean, there's one quote where Luther says, people receive more in their parish than they receive from the Pope. But have I answered your question?
We can continue later.
Sure, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Theo. Your question is very good, and is the question that I've been anguishing about, because I'm quite aware that the oikos is not the oikos, and so it cannot be transferred. That's the reason why I try to find that which I call the operational and critical principle that is at work. And I'm quite convinced that that behind this understanding of the ancient oikos for Aristotle was this notion of the poiesis, and that is the reason why from there I attempted to reconstruct it once more. But from that dianoia of poiesis, I try to reconstruct it in a way in which it can be applicable today. And that's the reason why, for example, I did not follow Bonhoeffer on this, because Bonhoeffer was quite aware of the fact, and so he divides to split the economy in two mandates, right? Which is marriage and economy, and labor. He calls it labor. So he splits the two in this one in two, and keeps the other two, the church and the state, and so I didn't do that, because I think there is something very interesting in the connection that exists and that's coming to the fore once more, particularly in marginal communities and in the world, and also in migrant communities. The strict connection that I was referring early in a comment to Christiane, the strict connection between the dimensions of production and reproduction, and that is why I did not opt, which I found very attractive. I did not opt to go for Bonhoeffer's solution. I think it was an easy solution, but I think I get more out of the attempt of recasting it in the context of modern society in face of the social crises that we are experiencing, which, in my understanding, are now again fundamentally economic.
As promised, without ignoring the fact that I have seen a couple of other hands, I would like to interject a couple of observations which may also salt the audience with ideas for questions. And that's just to point out, among the many fascinating themes roiling under the surface of this weekend, a couple of particularly fruitful points that seem to be arising from this conversation. One of them is this, that one could say arguably that there have been periods in Luther studies when radical interdisciplinarity would be getting together a systematic theologian, an historical theologian, and a biblical scholar. I think that this weekend demonstrates that Luther studies has moved well beyond that point. The question of philosophy, the question of history, the question of psychology. In my own conversational circles, the contributions of anthropology have become extraordinarily relevant to both contemporary constructive theology and to the interpretation of the historical tradition in the church. And I think this kind of conversation is becoming very fruitful here, but it would be interesting to hear people talk about how exactly to go about that, how exactly to bring all of these things into legitimate, true interdisciplinary connection. The second one, and I think both of these are connected through their global dimension, through their intercultural dimension, is that, as always, the theology and the ministry and politics of the church in action in its globally various contexts is a challenge for bringing Luther forward in our contemporary setting. And I think that this panel has been very careful and concerned about that in its various ways, has demonstrated ways of going back and mining Luther and asking something like the question, what would Luther say in the contemporary context, but trying to do that honestly and with a great deal of integrity. So I want to thank those who have contributed to this wonderful discussion in those lights, and invite us to continue along those lines. But I think Professor Burghardt had a hand up, and there may be someone else over here, I believe, who did.
Yes, am I still allowed to just ask a question? I had a question for Christiane Tietz, as you might imagine. No, a friendly question, but I think, you'll decide that. You're dealing with the vociferousness, the vehemence, the violence of Luther's language in the 1525 text, and you said you didn't want to apologize for it, but rather to put it in its context. It's the context of its historical circumstances and its theological argument. That I think the effect of that is still to apologize for it because it tends to explain it away. In other words, there's a certain danger in contextualization because it can easily explain away, but can also call forth further contextualization that explains back in, so that I think that one could as easily say that Luther had already educated the people to revolution, right, in the Adel. His whole, I discussed this at length, and I won't rehearse what I had to say yesterday, but that is a polemic that calls for revolution, that teaches revolution, and it's also a polemic that calls for violence. Later in the text, he talks about how we hang and behead robbers and thieves. Why not the Romans? And this is this quote from the third part of the text. So he has educated his public, and we know through the dissemination of it that he has educated a public, a large public. He has educated them to rebellion and to violence. Now, certainly it was directed against Rome, but this is a structural similarity, right? The nobility that he's addressing in Adel, right, educating them to violence and revolution against Rome, right? But in its dissemination, there's a structural analog in the common people and the peasants, or a potential structural analog in being educated to violence against those who oppress them, namely the nobility, as the 12 articles and Luther's response to that make clear. So I think we do have to, what we end up with are the actual words of the text, and he does say schlage, würge, and so on and so forth. Hier wer da kann, right? So do everything you can to put them down, as if they were animals. Yeah, I would just offer that sort of counter contextualization.
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much. Because when I wrote the sentence, I don't want to apologize him. I was sure I'm apologizing, of course. So you recognize this very carefully. Nevertheless, I would repeat my comment from yesterday, saying I agree that the text from 1520 can be understood in that way, that he educates people to revolt against political leaders. I would nevertheless say his aim in this text is to revolt against the Catholic Church, because they suppress the gospel, and this is the main interest here. And they use political means to oppress the gospel, and this was the focus of this thing. And it's interesting, of course, you have these structural analogies, but I would say you nevertheless should distinguish between the church, where you have the priesthood of all believers and should, of course, need some orders, but not orders of violence. And where you have the political realm where you need violence because those are not everybody here is a Christian. And the Christians, of course, have this ambivalent existence as saints and sinners at the same time. So therefore, you need violence in this realm. But it's not, I think the analogy of structures does not, that does not supply arguments for saying, well, so we have to behave here as well as we do there. And maybe the final thing I would like to say is, which is very interesting when you read Luther, that he's very afraid that the princes themselves would fight against the Caesar. So he nevertheless has this, in the political realm, he's not only arguing against the peasants and say, well, you should be submissive, you should be obedient. No, he also says to the princes, until a certain point, you should be obedient to the Caesar as well, until he figures out that the political concept of the Caesar is different, and the Caesar is instituted by the princes. And when he was informed about that political reality, he said, well, you can fight against the Caesar as well. So there he has political concepts arguing for violence and arguing for revolt or so, but it's not a spiritual concept that he uses here. Yeah. It might not be satisfying, but yeah, that would be nice. Yeah.
Right. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question about Luther and political change. I read some of the texts from the era of the Peasants' Revolt a few months ago. And as we've heard this afternoon, I didn't read a Luther who always approved of what the authorities did. I read a Luther who was prepared sometimes to be very critical. But nevertheless, I can't remember exactly where, but I remember reading him saying, directed towards the peasants, that one of the reasons that revolt was wrong was that whatever form of government they replaced the current authorities with would inevitably be worse. And I mean, two things struck me about that. One, how depressingly often he's been proved right, but even allowing for that, in a context today, if we're thinking about the global Luther, where radical political change seems to be needed in so many contexts in today's world, does Luther and his theology of the two kingdoms have anything to say to us about the possibilities of positive political upheaval and radical change? Or as has been said already, do we simply live in too different a world for him to be relevant?
I would like to, if I may answer to this, I liked your argument, Hans-Peter Großhans, very much saying this is actually what it has to say in regard to our political context. The political realm needs justice, righteousness, peace, and natural law in terms of human rights and so on and so forth. They are very important here. So it's and I think this is there's not nothing, and it would be very wonderful if we could achieve this, and the church should remind the political leaders that this is what the worldly kingdom is good for. It's not for its own sake. It's it's also good for helping that economics is not too much is not governed by sin, or it's not, or it should reduce the outcome of the results of sin in the economical realm. So this would be the second thing where I think Luther is very helpful today. Say we need politics to govern economics realities here.
One other quick thing, observation is the very nice affirmation Luther makes at certain points that it's better to be governed by an honest Turk than a crooked Christian in the global context. I think is a kind of a wow, something to think about. So.
I think theoretically the question is very interesting, because theoretically we find resources in Luther in order to say, well, when he says how should the earthly government be ruled, and he says clearly it is by reason in order to achieve equity. But it says, well, it is a mess, and therefore the sword is here. like to build a dam against, he used the image of the flood. So we need to build dams in order to avoid the flood. And there is no question that, that socially, however, and culturally, apart from finding some insights that are helpful for our situation, I don't think he really thought that, that Romans 13, which he used quite a lot in this context, could suppose of any change in regime, except there was one exception for Luther on the question of politics, that politics could be changed, and that was through an exceptional action of what he calls the heroes, or the heroic man, right? The vir heroicus, and which are especially commissioned by God to bring about some change. And but these are exceptional moments in history. So he really, by even creating that exceptional measure, he really showed that that he didn't have so much in his cultural milieu, so much flexibility to really think about a dynamic way in which society could be transformed.
I would like to add one thing which I consider as important in the interreligious dialogue to which we come tonight. I think Luther's doctrine of two kingdoms is interesting because it's a religious approach of justifying reason in the public realm. And I think this is important in our days. Say we need reason in the public realm, and we cannot just simply say, well, this is our religious perspective and this is why we do it. But it's a religious theory for that. And I wonder if we could not bring this into interreligious dialogue, saying there are religious theories for the secular state, if you will. There are religious theories for using reason in the public realm, and it's not a liberal theory of saying it's reason just doing whatever it wants. It's a governed reason.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Anything goes.
Yeah.
Further questions? Yes.
I would just like you to expand on your 3 points of reproduction and sustainability, given that Luther didn't know that plastics and PCPs and all this would come about, and people predicting the extinction of the world through global warming, and if we don't reduce carbon dioxide levels, blah, 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 we won't be here.
It's, well, I think that the connection between the present situation of the environmental crisis and the question of Luther's understanding of the oikos at this time should be addressed precisely on the question of what is being thrown away, and by which mechanisms is this things being thrown away. His references, although he was not experiencing whatever we are experiencing now in terms of the environmental crisis, his experience of the economic impoverishment of the people, particularly the peasants of his day, gives a parallel to the way in which we also could understand what the system, in this case, was the financial capitalism that was beginning at his age, what that financial capitalism was doing in bringing in reducing to abject poverty so many people at this time. I think the same kind of an argument could also be transferred to the way in which the natural environment is being exploited. But more than that, I would have to think better.
Other questions? Yes, Bishop Yunan.
I am sorry to another time discuss with Christiani, but I am a little bit disturbed by the which I mean, also a professor he mentioned about the violence. And I would like really to discuss it more in detail. Maybe it's not the time here, because when we use that, we can use violence in a secular way or with the state. And if we take, the present situation in which we are living, what does violence mean? Does it mean resistance against the authority? Does it mean humanitarian intervention, which is in Kosovo or Serbia? Or preventive attack, which is in Iraq? So, I mean, or others are coming, we don't know what they are. So, I mean, I would like really to sharpen what are the rules of violence if we really are speaking on that we can use violence as a Christian church. I want to connect it still that the 20th century has given us another kind, you know, of non-violence, like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. and others. And maybe there wasn't a Lutheran among them, but you see, at least they have used biblical texts to speak on non-violence. Now, how much we Lutherans can accommodate that in our theology? Because I personally believe in non-violence. Even I'm a Palestinian living under occupation, and I'm oppressed every day and harassed. But I believe in non-violence from my Lutheran, you know, of course I don't want now to speak what I want to speak, but from my Lutheran also belief and what Luther taught me. Now, this is the reason I want really to discuss more about it. And with you, maybe the time is so short, but I am disturbed to give that violence, it can be used with the state, but not in the church. I think sometimes we have violence in the church more than with the state, you see. We have really to be careful. I'm sorry to be so blunt in this.
Thank you very much for asking back. I think what Luther really would argue, and Luther would be totally on your side saying, if we as people do something, non-violence always is the rule we should follow. So in the civil rights movement, it was important that it was a non-violent movement and it was not just, and the Black Power movement, Luther would say, was wrong because it's not how we do this. Nevertheless, if you read his text about war, he's supporting soldiers, of course, and he says this is important that we do this. I think the question is, as you said, can we find rules, can we find justifications for that? In the international realm, it would be, I think you cannot just go and intervene in another country. You really need some institution who justifies that. Maybe not in the sense of, not in the sense of a just war, but maybe in the sense of a justified is difficult here, but maybe in the sense of a necessary, unavoidable war or something like that. And the institution of the UN, for example, really tries to do this. I met with a person in New York City who is responsible for those genocide things, and he really argued for this. It's important that we have the Institute of the United Nations who not just says, well, this is over there, we don't use violence. Sometimes there's a situation where we have to go into another country and help and avoid the worst case in going there with military. But it has to be a democratic process. There have to be some rules where we say there's not just I, as a president of a country, I'm going somewhere. So there needs to be some criteria and some controlling things which try to figure that out. So, and I would say the institution of the United Nations is not a neutral institution and problematic, but it would be an institution who tries to really find means to do it in an adequate way. And I would say that if you would say, no, we don't do this at all, and we Christians, we just stay out of that whole realm, so we never become soldiers, and the Christian government should never engage in a war. I think I can understand the position, but I would say as a political position, it might be difficult, and one might get guilty. The other question is, what do you do as a people? And I would strongly say, of course, it's important not just to do something in that way. And Gandhi's very impressive, and he was successful in this. That's why we can really be happy about that he was so successful in that regard. Yeah.
I think this is a perfect place to stop the formal conversation, although I am sure the informal conversation will continue. First of all, I hope that you will all join us back here at 7 p.m. for Bishop Yunan's address and for the panel that will follow it, and the reception, naturally. And secondly, I hope you will join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their very thought-provoking papers.